This episode is brought to you by Progressive. Progressive helps you compare direct auto rates from a variety of companies so you can find a great one, even if it's not with them. Quote today at Progressive.com to find a rate that works with your budget. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. Third Parties Week continues, part of our election year series of conversations around some of the key rhythms and themes in an election year, and we are talking about the role of third parties and third-party candidates and notable candidates. Last episode, we did a bit of an overview with our pal Dave Weigel. We laid out some categories for who decides to run as a third-party candidate, who decides to vote for third-party candidates, and of course, one of the people who came up in that episode, and we probably have to talk about as the first one in this series, is a look at Ralph Nader in the year 2000. Look, the 543 votes by which Bush beat Gore in Florida and the Supreme Court intervention and the question of whether Nader drew those votes from Gore and tipped the election, that is one of the most litigated stories in modern political history. We will touch on that, but I really think what's worth doing is revisiting the months before the hanging chads and the blame game and all of that to get a sense of why Nader was running to begin with as a third-party candidate, why he was finding an audience, and also this really interesting question of whether people saw him as a quote-unquote spoiler before the election. And going back and reading some of the coverage and looking at this, I've been really surprised to reread some of the discourse around Nader's run in the months before what went down in Florida. So let's talk about Ralph Nader, year 2000. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Ralph Nader running 2000 as a Green Party candidate. In this year, 2000, who is he in the sort of larger political spectrum, and why is he deciding to mount this campaign?
So Nader was kind of the darling of the American left at this point in time. He had come up in the 1970s, kind of become a household name as a consumer protection guy. So anti-corporations, he'd led to a lot of litigation and legislation around consumer rights. And in the 1990s, when the U.S. left felt pretty adrift, right? The Democratic Party had moved to the right. The Cold War was over, and that had given a sense for some people that capitalism had won, and critiques of capitalism were now out of fashion. There was a left, but it wasn't breaking through in the same way. And a year before Nader's 2000 campaign, in 1999, I can't remember if we've done an episode on the battle for Seattle, but there is this kind of big gathering of all of these different left-wing groups. It's labor and environmentalist and consumer protection people and anarchists. And you've got all of these people who have come together to protest the World Trade Organization and the lack of consumer and worker and environmental protections in these free trade deals. And Ralph Nader comes to represent that movement that was there at Seattle. And so this left that has felt very adrift and rejected for about a decade latches onto Nader as their guy, right? Their vote in 2000.
You know, last episode we talked about some basic categories of who third-party candidates are, and we sort of noodled on this idea of some candidates are really about the issues, and some candidates are a little more about cult of personality, and some are kind of protesting the system itself. And Nader, as I think is the case with most third-party, relatively successful third-party candidates, he really is an amalgamation of all of those things, right?
Yeah.
He has a name recognition, which I think is hard to understate. He's been in the consciousness for a long while. But his issue is this question of, and he says this, a lot of us feel like the Republican and Democratic parties are indistinguishable from each other right now, especially on economic issues, which, I think Clinton... Not wrong. Yeah. Clinton, that was what he was up to. He was sort of pretty upfront about triangulation and sort of moving a little bit more towards free trade and neoliberalism during his term. And so, he takes this issue, but then he also marries it with the critique of the electoral system itself, too, which say we have these two parties that are essentially the same, and we have a system that only allows space for those two parties. And so what we need is a third party to both raise the issue, but also critique the way that we elect the president as well.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this before, but there's never really been a moment in which, unless you're thinking about like the 19th century, where third parties have had this major platform where it feels like everything could be up for grabs. Like, it has always felt like lock and step, Republican or Democrat. And I do think people get fatigued by that. People get tired of the same old, and the fact that you have Gore, who was vice president for Clinton. You have Bush, who is the son of Papa Bush. I mean, you have candidates that feel relatively familiar and have been all around this political mulberry bush before. It doesn't feel like you have anyone that's coming out the gate that's sort of fresh and unheard of. And because of that, I do think there's a lot of voter apathy of more of the same.
Yeah.
Right. And it's in part about kind of the relative blandness of the two candidates and the familiarity of them, but also this very systemic critique of why do you get candidates like this? Why do you get Al Gore, the son of a senator? Why do you get George W. Bush, the son of a president, as your candidates of these two major parties? And why do their policies look so much the same, especially on economics? Well, it's because of the money that goes into campaigns. It's because of the way that corporations help to shape who the candidates are going to be and ensure that they've kind of captured these candidates in advance. And so his ability to take that voter discontent and to give a framework for understanding it in terms of systems that can be reformed. That feels like an interesting and useful move by Nader there.
Yeah. What kind of things did you write growing up? Did you write diaries or love letters or melodramatic poetry about the fate of mankind? And could you ever imagine getting on stage and reading those things in front of strangers? I know that I've basically memory holed a lot of that stuff, and no thank you, I am not interested in that. But luckily, plenty of people are, and the result is our fellow Radiotopia show, the Mortified podcast. It is back with new episodes celebrating the 20th anniversary of the stage show that inspired the podcast. There's more laughs, more teenage writings, more awkwardness. In fact, Mortified is hosting its first ever Tournament of Teen Angst, where participants like this person compete for the title of Most Mortified.
January 12th. I keep looking at Matt, and he then stares at me. I wish he stared at me because he likes me, not because he knows I stare at him.
So go check it out, and congrats to Mortified, one of the OG Radiotopia podcasts, on this incredible milestone, 20 years of their live show. The podcast is really wonderful listening. Mortified, wherever you get your podcasts. He did face, and it's really interesting to compare Nader 2000 to, say, Bernie Sanders in 2016. He did face this question of whether to run in the Democratic primary and try and pull the electorate, to the left, or to run as a third party. And there's a million factors there, but it is fascinating that he did choose that route and received a lot of criticism. I mean, there were a lot of people who were sympathetic to his critiques who said the way that you move the party to the left is by creating a coalition between your voters and the Gore voters, and you do that within the party rather than mounting a third-party green campaign.
Right. And the idea of a spoiler, which comes up a ton when it comes to third-party candidates, it's really premised on the idea that you can kind of cleave the electorate in half, and you have lefts and liberals and people who are, the right, conservative. And so Nader is clearly somebody who is going to be taking from that left side of the spectrum. And I think that the spoiler idea is basically like, we as Democrats, those votes on the left side of the spectrum belong to us. Yeah. And so if you take those votes, you have taken something from us. And in a two-party first-past-the-post race, you could take the votes that we need in order to win the election. And of course, third-party candidates are like, well, go win those votes then.
Yeah.
But that, I think, is the thinking and the presumption behind the idea of a spoiler.
Yeah. If we lose, it's your fault. Has nothing to do with our ability to connect with voters. It's all about you splitting the vote or taking away votes that we could have used.
So before we go deeper into this question of the spoiler and a lot of the, I think, pre-election critique around this spoiler question, I just wanted to share that, I was in college during this race, and I have a couple memories of the way that this race played out. one of which I think is very telling, was that, it felt like, and I think it was largely the case, that on my campus, the big divide in the presidential election was between Nader and Gore, not, between Gore and Bush, and it was just like, talk about the bubble that, I was living in on my lefty college campus, which is fine. I mean, like, we all live in bubbles. But I just remember this heated debate where Bush's name wouldn't even come up, and it was really about, are you going to vote for Nader or are you going to vote for Gore? But I
That's
also...
funny,
yeah. No, do you have...
Oh, I was just going to say it was completely different
Right.
on an HBCU campus.
Exactly. Well, wait, what was the debate there?
Well, I remember because Al Gore came to campus and they had these blue posters that said African Americans for Gore. And in the auditorium, students started ripping off the African and saying, like, why are you playing us? We're Americans. We're Americans for Gore. Why are you trying to, tip your hand towards speaking to the Black community in that way? And it just got really controversial and messy. But it was never a question of Nader or Gore or Bush. It was always about Gore.
Yeah. Well, that's the other memory I have, is that, like, so much of this, and it's resonant to now, I think it's resonant to 2016, so much of this plays out around this question of, do people feel enthusiastic about Al Gore in this moment, And I remember hearing in 2000, the first time I heard this sort of line of, like, you'd hear Nader supporters say, it's nice to have something to vote for, not just vote against, And I've been told so often, okay, my vote as a Democrat is really to prevent a Republican, a dangerous Republican, from getting into office. And now finally I have someone who I just feel really enthusiastic about voting for. And obviously we heard that with Bernie Sanders supporters.
Yes.
But, that's a huge part of this, is when there's that sort of enthusiasm gap or whatever, you see these third-party candidates rush in and fill that vacuum.
And if somebody feels electric about a candidate like that, they should vote for them.
And it means something.
Yes.
Yeah.
Who are we to say no? Tote the party line.
Right. Yes. And also, beyond that, party leaders need to kind of be very upfront about that, about what's going on there. They can't just sort of brush that dynamic away, as we've seen. Okay. Let's talk about this spoiler question. Because to me, I said it in the intro, but to me the big interesting thing here is that this conversation of, oh gosh, what is Nader going to do to Gore's chances of winning this election, was very present in the months leading up to the election and talked about very explicitly in a way that maybe people have forgotten. I think that there's maybe this story of that election of, like, everyone woke up the next day and realized what had happened. But no, people were talking about the spoiler, and even Gore himself in October says basically a vote for Nader is a vote for Bush. And Clinton started to say the same thing as they saw how tight the election was going to be.
Right. I mean, you have people like E.J. Dionne, who's been a longtime columnist at the Washington Post, saying, I get it. Like, I get that Nader wants to move the party to the left, but his campaign is, as Dionne writes, built on the flawed assumption that it makes little difference whether Bush or Gore wins. And he's like, yes, you should push the party to the left, but you can't do it from outside of the party. You have to work within the party. You have to work with moderate reformers, even though you don't particularly like them. And so he has kind of that, critique of working in the party or out of the party. But I think that most of the folks who were shouting at Nader that were much more explicit in the way that you say, like, he's taking votes away from Gore, and that is going to make George W. Bush president. And we don't want George W. Bush to be president.
I mean, to be fair, Nader's not the only third party person running. Like, Pat Buchanan and Harry Brown get 33,000 votes. The Workers' World Party gets 1,500 votes. You only needed 438 to win.
Right.
So it's not like it can all fall on. Now, again, he gets the largest share of the third party vote. So, it's easy to sort of.
And there's the idea that his voters would have gone to Gore,
yes,
had they not been there. But yes, I mean, we've said this a million times on the show. When an election is that close, you can point to one of 100 reasons and say, oh, that was the tipping. On the last episode that we did, Dave Weigel did make an interesting point that really a big part of this was also that Nader changed Gore's strategy, in the months leading up to the election. He had to sort of take on a more populist message in some Midwest states, and maybe that sort of tipped things a little bit and had some ripple effects that it wouldn't have. So, when you think about the impact of a third party, it's not just moving blue and red dots from one column to another. It's really this larger question of how the entire campaign plays out. But, you know, when you hear Nader talk about this election, I mean, he basically ties it to this larger thing that we mentioned earlier of just like, you know, when someone isn't able to achieve what they want to achieve, they look for a scapegoat. And, you know, that was happening before the election, and it certainly was happening in the wake of the election as well.
Yeah, I think that's true, too. No one really wants to get at the heart of why people don't want to vote for them. I mean, or what would be required in order for Gore to be more attractive? Is he willing to do that work? You don't see that. And
you could tell that Nader bristles at that word spoiler specifically. I mean, even just this year, he gave an interview and he basically says, and this is a good final line to end on, but he says, you know, when people say we're spoiling an election, what are we spoiling? We're trying to go after a system that is spoiled to the core, as he says. So
again,
you know.
not wrong.
It feels like it's such a succinct expression of what his campaign was about. So perfect line.
Yeah.
And let's leave it there. Okay, so that's it for this episode of Third Parties Week. The 2 of 4. We will continue with a look at some other candidates as we go, but Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
I have no idea why they are so virulently anti-Green Party candidacy.
Well, excuse me, sir, but yes, you do. I mean, like a lot of Democrats, newspapers think that you may throw this race to Bush, and they want to go to Gore.
Why do you think I should be worried about that? If I was worried about whether Gore or Bush were going to be elected, would I be running for president to establish a progressive political reform movement before and after November 7th, which is what we're trying to do? Well, you know, do you think Gore is entitled to any votes? Do you think Bush is entitled? Am I entitled to any votes? We have to earn them. If Gore cannot beat the bumbling Texas governor with that horrific record, what good is he? What good is he? Good heavens.
Radiotopia.